right, so for the last of the parts of this human migration and gene flow across the world, I thought we'd just look at more recent. Now, more recent, we mean in recorded history, and we'll talk about some that are ongoing at the moment, but we're not talking about populating the world from an African origin per se, or what happened to the Neanderthals. We're talking about more recent. And of course, one of the things is to keep in mind is that even though I often have said this, a gene's home range is a lot larger than the species home range. And that may make sense, or the population's home range, I should say. So you have a group, a population, genes move in and out of that, and often in a much wider range than the actual individuals. And we see this in nature quite often. We have a group, a population, and we find out that some of their genes are over here and some are over here, but individuals, if you monitor them, if you radio track them or follow them, they don't go there, okay, very often. So how does that happen? Well, it takes very, very few individuals that go from one population to another each generation, in fact, really by one or two, to have major exchange of gene flow. So as far as genetics of humans, the physical movement of humans isn't necessarily what has to happen. Now, we do have a lot of that. We're going to talk about it. But the reason I bring that up is that these are the trade routes, and there were trade routes for thousands of years before this as well. We know that because there were shells found, in Central Europe that clearly came from the coast somewhere. There were other materials and things brought forth, goods and things brought many, many miles away. Now, what happens is when you have trade routes, just like when you have wars, you tend to have your genes move with you, okay? It's just part of human nature. And of course, the great Silk routes, the Silk Road that came through and across here, all along there were outposts for various things, and people would stop. The salt was one of the, for a long, long time, was one of the most important things. It was worth more than gold. And the salt trails that came up, like caravans that came up through Egypt and other places from bringing salt and across these regions. And so, there was gene flow, right? I mean, it's just the way it is. If you have a city, you have people coming in and out of that city, you have transport, you're going to have gene flow. Same thing happens when you have wars and you have armies move through. They leave their genes and they pick up genes, okay? With families and bring them back and that sort of thing. And we see that in modern times. If you know anyone that's been in the military, they may have a spouse or something that came from another part of the world, or they may just, you can just see the outcomes of that as we move through. But anyway, the point of that is that we've got all these trade routes. They've been there for thousands of years in various ways, some at various points more intense than others. And in that, we move our genes around, okay? So the migration, we're really talking about the gene migration, okay? Now, there has been a lot of physical migration. This is some of the world migration maps. This isn't all of them by any stretch of the imagination. We have the Huguenot groups going to South America and going into South Africa. We have all sorts of movements that aren't identified here, but these are just some of the big ones. Okay, Europeans have certainly moved toward the New World. They have the Chinese have moved in and out of various places around the world. Been lots of things. A lot of this has to do with colonization. For example, one of the reasons to move from India to the UK was the fact that this was a British colony. And lots of other things that have come along from there. These were movements that brought in people into Australia, both natural from Europe, from the Asian area to original establishment to the fact that it was a colony of the British Empire. If you go into Argentina, it's a beautiful area, and you'll find that a lot of places make a really good German beer. And the reason they make a really good German beer is a lot of Germans were moved there and established things. Large waves all over the country. Of course, we have sort of populations going north and south from Central America and South America, etc. So point is, and some of these are movements because of environment, because people had to move because the the resources weren't there. Some of them are expulsions because people would say, no, you've got to get out. Some are nomadic. We just have some nomadic groups that move around. There are groups out of India and others that move. We have lots of different things that move individuals in these migration patterns. Okay, and we've talked about some of that. So I just want to say this: we move, and humans are very moving. And now that we've had modern transportation with airplanes, you can fly from New York and be over here wherever you want in Europe in a few hours. We tend to have even more movement currently. Okay, now I just wanted to highlight a few. We in this part of the world, and certainly in the eastern U.S., a couple of big movements that came in. Besides, we know the Pilgrims and others that came in to populate the New World. We also had other individuals, many individuals come in. One was the Scotch Irish, who came in a wave of about 5 different groups over about a 50-year period. These were lowland Scots, as they were called. They weren't the ones with the bagpipes and all that. They were lowland Scots. They came primarily because, not for political reasons, like many people, or at least religious reasons, like many groups came to the U.S., but because of economics. The English had subjugated this group, and they weren't allowed to sell their wool and their meats and stuff, and so they basically had taken away all the resources. And so they migrated out in mass numbers just because they didn't have a way to make a living. And a lot of them came to the U.S., and again, about 5 different waves of them. They settled in Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and North Carolina, some of these regions in here. And they were basically moving down along some roads that had been built in, some wagon trails. And they were actually leaving, as they would do that, they would leave populations, they would make little towns and areas about every 8 to 10 miles as they moved through. So this became an area that was pretty well heavily populated by the Scotch Irish. Now this was before, notice this date, right before the Revolutionary War, and they played a major role as soldiers in the Revolutionary War. Other, ones that affected the U.S. greatly were things like the Great Irish Potato Famine, as it was known. And this was not only failure of a potato crop, which was the primary food source for many people in Ireland, but because of the plague, this potato blight that came in, because potatoes were brought from the New World, they were brought over, propagated. Irish potatoes are essentially one big genetic clone, and once something hit that, there was no genetic variation, and we lost. And this happened over several times. Okay, it wasn't just one famine, but a couple. And they moved out. The others were, you may have heard the term, that's beyond the pale. Okay, beyond the pale was a fence line, was actually stakes in the ground in Ireland, and beyond the pale were the English considered those people to be basically savages or sub. They didn't have full citizenship or anything else, and so there was economic problems, there was food problems, and certainly strong political problems that forced people from Ireland to move. Now, Ireland's have been moving for decades or for millennia, really. In fact, the Scotch Irish, the reason they're called Scotch Irish is that the Irish had moved into Scotland, brought in the form of government and all sorts of things to Scotland, and they moved all around. But this was one of the big movements. And of course, when they move, they bring things with them. You may have heritage that's from Ireland or some other place. Some other ones that we might want to think about are things like the Jewish populations around the world. At one point, Judaism was widespread throughout Europe. Been there for thousands of years. It was widespread, and at various times there were movements, both migration, natural movements of individuals, populations, as well as expulsions. And just at various times there would be different types of expulsions that would go on. Spain, well, think about Spain. It had obviously a large Christian population, Catholic population, but about 1100, you had these individuals come in that brought in Islam. Okay, so it was a Muslim state, Islamic state. In fact, if you go to Granada, you can see the beautiful Alhambra and places. Or if you go to near Madrid, south of Madrid, you can go to Toledo, and you can see right there, those beautiful cathedrals on the hills, the Catholic cathedrals. Right down the street are these Jewish symbols and Jewish, clearly from the past. And then there's a Muslim-based, some things in Arabic type scriptures and beautiful buildings. And for many, many centuries, people lived pretty much together. They it was a very thing. But in 1492, well, it was 1100 when the first Muslim came in. There was conflict. But in 1492, there was a decree that said you either convert to Catholicism or you leave. And the reason for that was because people had been converting. They didn't want them to convert back to Judaism. They wanted to stay, so they expelled them. There were expulsions from all other parts of the world at various times, and then forced migration and movement of these religious groups. We tried the same thing here, and I think it was during the Vicksburg campaign during the Civil War. Grant had taken over Vicksburg, and he decreed that anyone that was Jewish religion would be removed from Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And actually attempted to do this, and they went up. One of the places was in Holly Springs, Mississippi. If you've ever been there, south of Memphis. That was a supply depot, and they started rounding up families, Jewish families, and trying to move them out. And the basic idea was that they were cooperating with the Southerners in cotton movements, and that they wanted to stop. That was one of the resources. That was the resource of the South for most of it, and so they were. This was a big deal, and when Grant ran for president, he had to defend this idea. Lincoln, it lasted less than a year. Lincoln and Congress got involved and said, no, you're not going to do that. But it was even in our country. We had an expulsion order put forward by the things. So anyway, I had these great movements. Now, of course, the biggest movement in very recent history was prior to and during the Second World War. Europe at that time had about the start of the 1930s, had about 8 million individuals who identified as Jewish. By the end of the Second World War, it was down to about 1.5 million or so. And a lot of that to migration, a lot of it, of course, to tragic events by Germany. But it caused migration, right? A lot of those individuals came to the U.S., where there was already established populations, particularly in the eastern seaboard. A number of them went to South America and other places and brought in techniques. And they had been moving before. Okay, this, of course, eventually, they went into Palestine, which became the Islamic State. Sorry, I'm messing that up. Became the Jewish state of Israel. Okay, and I'm thinking about the Islamic State trying to be there. And then they moved to other, various other parts of the world. Interestingly, it was some Jewish settlers early on that came to South America. This is long before this. They figured out how to take sugarcane and to convert it into sugar and then convert it into rum. And they actually brought that technology up into the islands. That's what drove, in fact, the trade. And was this technological development that came out of the Jewish population in South America and made the rum and made it stable and sugar production. They brought it into the Caribbean. Okay? Anyway, they just moved for various reasons. Now, sometimes we move because we want to. Sometimes we move because we have to, and sometimes we're moved. And those movements in many cases, are not why we wanted to move, right? They have really problematic things. Now, slavery is a part of human history. It's not a good part of human history, but it's a part of human history. If you go back and look, anytime there was war, invasions, movements, very often enslaved individuals. You can see that in Central Europe from the grave sites, where a group would come through and clearly would enslave or subjugate the existing populations. And this had happened in various parts of the world, and still goes on to some degree. We don't call it that, but if you really look at the political outcomes of it, it's essentially maybe an economic slavery when it happens. But forced slavery, and of course, bringing Africans to the New World for things and treating them as property, which is different than, say, indentured servitude or something where they're not considered property, even though they were held under conditions, was a major event, right? We brought individuals over against their will, and they were deposited and sold and all sorts of horrible things that were done to basically become free or cheap labor, right? Very cheap labor. And this was migration, right? It's forced migration movement, but it was in fact migration. And then from this, what we see, of course, is that by 1700, 1800s, as far as the United States is concerned, the majority of these African descended individuals are found in the South, and that continued on throughout the 1800s, post-Civil War. And it was only after Reconstruction and about 1910 and about into this, around 1930, so during the First World War time, that we started to see a movement out of the South and movement toward the North. And this was for a number of reasons, and some of the same reasons that caused the second Great Migration is economic. People could move, okay, and they were trying to move. Now, the second Great Migration, which really is, you can follow the paths of that between 1940 and 1970, had a number of reasons, but a lot of it was economics. Okay, by the 1940s, there were opportunities to work in the North, and because the war had come along and people were needed. People had served in the war, of course, but they were also needed in factories and other places and industry. And so there was money to be made, and people moved in order to better their lives and to make the resources. So we had a huge migration out of the South back to the North. And now there's some other bad reasons for this as well. It was, there was still a lot of segregation in the South. There was a lot of social unrest regarding the races in the South. There were some very terrible practices as far as economics, foreclosures of property because people, maybe weren't as highly educated and would sign away their property without knowing it for a few $100s, and the bank would foreclose because somebody wanted to develop a big property unit or something. There was all sorts of reasons, but the migration was out. And the most recently, there's been an increase. People have come back to the South for economic opportunities and for families and for other reasons. But the Great Migrations, the second Great Migration, really, if you look along here, you can kind of see how this occurred. From Mississippi and Alabama, primarily up into the industrial heartland of the U.S. around Detroit and other areas, Chicago. Taking with them lots of cool stuff, music, and all sorts of things. From these areas, we tended to move more to the west, okay? And along the seaboard, moving up into areas of Philadelphia, New York City, and on up into where there was work, right? And now these are routes. What are these routes? Well, if you really follow along with major railroad lines and easy railroad line access, a lot of this has to do with the eastern seaboard, northern tracts of there. Through here, there were tracks that you could get north of Chicago and St. Louis and others on the railroads, the same way from over here. Right? Now, again, with this, of course, you get movement of people. And when you move people, you move genes, you move genetics. And you see that. If you look at the populations that we have around country in various ways, you see admixture of these groups. If you think about Native American groups, okay, I think about Europeans that have come in, and you look at Africans that were brought in for the most part. And you see, if you go various ways, you see if you look at our chromosome structures, if you take, they're made up by different forms, right? So, for example, if you go over to, if you look at South Carolina, someplace you might find 80-something%, as well as most of the South, 80% of anyone who identifies as with African ancestry, African American, will mostly be African American, but they will have some European, and they will even have some Native American, depending on where you are. Okay, and those vary across the country and the various things. So this is what this little sample is down here, showing that there's admixture, okay, of populations, and that there's reform. So people move. Where there's people, there's genes. Even if they don't move, they still mix in various ways. Sometimes unfortunate ways, but oftentimes not, and you know, other ways. And we get admixture, just like we got admixture between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Wherever you go in the world, if there's been contact between peoples, if there's been movements between peoples, okay, you will find that there's, in fact, gene flow, right? And you see that in this sort of pattern that you see here. So it's very, you know, it's a classic part of human life. It doesn't matter whether you're thinking about tribal groups in the Amazon, or where you're talking about groups in Europe, or you're talking about the gypsies, or you're talking about whoever. There's movement and there's admixture. Okay? All right. So where are we seeing some of the current stuff? Well, obviously, from Central and parts of Northern South America, we're seeing movements, attempted movements into the United States. Okay. In the past, we've seen movements from, say, like Vietnam. After the Vietnam War, there was a number of individuals came to the U.S. Right now, we're seeing migrations through Europe. Of course, you're seeing all the tragics of the events that are going on in Greece and places where refugee colonies, you know, are trying to move, and there's people lost almost daily crossing the Mediterranean in ships and things. There's migrations out of Africa where there's political unrest, where there's climate, where there's resources and all sorts of things. You're starting to see, you know, there's these hubs of migration that are moving through. Now, with any of these migrations, whether it was the Scotch Irish, whether it was the Irish, whatever, whether it was Italians when they came into the U.S., and currently, it's always been them and us. You know, peoples that are settled there, and you bring in migrants, and people coming in, immigration in, it's always them and us. People sit there going, oh, we don't like them. And it's just over and over again in human history. You can read about these events that occurred, about how people moved in, and unless they were just subjugating the population as a whole, if they were, you know, coming in and moving into the population, they were always thought of as, you know, in a bad way. You know, Irish, when they came into New York and came into the U.S. in great numbers in the 1850s, you know, they drink and they're, you know, we don't want those Irish around. Okay, they can only do this sort of work. If you take when the Italians came in, you know, they're violent. They did this back when the Vietnamese came in, you know, into the South. There's all this uproar about they fished all the little fish, and they were, you know, they were tearing up all the fisheries in the Gulf. Of course, now we've got the border and then the big border lines, and we got to stop these people from coming in because they're terrible people. That's just constant, you know, and it happens in Europe. You've got groups that are pushing back against migrants and things. But what I want you to know as an educated person is that this is a constant. When you bring new people into an area, unless they fully assimilate, which it's very difficult and very often not the thing you want them to do, there's always going to be conflict. And so, you know, trying to make a political play out of that, you know, isn't necessarily the best thing. Trying to figure out what's the cause of that. Did we cause it? You know, in the Middle East and places, we caused a lot of the problems. Is it something economics? Is it environment? Is it something that we can fix so that people want to stay here instead of coming up here? or they want to do here? You know, is it something? And that's been, you know, there are great organizations around the world that try to do that, take that approach instead of saying, you know, we're going to hate you and cage you and throw you back. Let's think about what's driving you here, because most of the times, if you're coming through here, you want to go back where your home was, right? You're not wanting to leave. And you see that as, you know, as people are coming back into the southern U.S., you know, that's coming back to where family is, coming back to things that they're comfortable. But again, anytime you have all this going on, you're going to have gene flow, and you're going to have mixing of the populations and mixing of flows. And that's, from a genetic standpoint, is pretty interesting stuff. All right, well, that pretty much sums up all I wanted to say about migrations and human systems. This is actually the last part of the lectures for this course. You know, we will move on now to some other things that you guys talk to us a little bit about your e-portfolios, tell us about some chromosomes, and do some other fun things.